Riff the Snow Dog by Michelle Murray. Riff was an Alaskan sled dog. He had white fur that blended with the snow. Black streaks ringed his ears and paws. It was fun running with the pack, pulling the sled. Still, it seemed his days were the same. Trudged through the snow and ice, the sled behind him. Up the mountain, down the mountain, around the river and back to camp. It was all the same, day after day. He wanted an adventure. Riff's master was good to him and treated him and the other dogs well. They were treated to extra slabs of meat for dinner if they had a hard run or their day ran long. His fur was untangled and brushed. Riff had his place in the line of snow dogs, and he had no reason to leave. Still, a longing for the outside world and exploration started building up inside of him. Every day, Riff woke up at dawn, the red sun rising over the white snow, making it look pink. His master would dole out breakfast, and he would go get in line with the rest of the pack. With a "hey!" they would start pulling the sled. The runners on the sled would glide through the snow as they ran. In the morning, Riff and the fellow dogs were always full on energy. They'd play and bite each other as they ran along, a little nip to the ear or tail just to say hello or a push to go faster. As they made their way through the Alaskan wilderness, delivering food, medicine, and other supplies, their energy would start to wane. They never fully rested until they came back to the snow dog camp late at night, after the sun had set and dark night covered the sky. This day the sun was shining bright overhead. They had a late start this morning, and there was an uneasiness in the air. The other dogs were restless, pawing at the snow and pacing around the camp. Their master seemed worried about something. He was muttering something out loud, but Riff couldn't understand him. The master whistled for the dogs to get in place and hitched Riff and the other dogs to their places. He gave the command, and they were off, with an empty sled behind them. Their master tugged on the lines, urging the team to go faster. Riff and the other dogs picked up the pace, and they were off, leaving lines in the snow where the sled had been. Riff and the other dogs were in sync, like a dance. Push, pull, forward, onward. They ran, pulling the empty sled behind them. They were gliding over a frozen river when the ice started to crack beneath them. Creaking, the ice started to spread apart right beneath their paws. Little cracks appeared, starting at the outer edge of the river. The cracks grew bigger, and soon holes appeared in the ice, showing the freezing water underneath. Their master, seeing what was happening, tried to steer the team away from the catastrophe. He had them turn right, then turn left. He made zigzags around the river, trying to find a spot to purchase to get the sled and the team across. The ice had other plans, and it started to break faster and faster. The master unhitched the dogs so they could climb to safety. Riff and the other dogs were trained to climb and swim. Being free of the sled, the dogs scrambled their way to the bank, all except Riff. Riff was hanging onto a piece of drifting ice with his claw when it turned over and dropped him in the water. Riff was sucked under into the waves of the river. He thought he heard his master call for him, but he couldn't escape the thralls of the stream. The current swept him away to where the ice was thicker, and he couldn't break through. Riff banged his head and paws on the ice to break free, but it was no use. He thought he heard his fellow sled dogs let out howls and whines, but they couldn't help him. As Riff was carried away with the current, he tried to get fresh air when he saw holes in the river where there was no ice. The river was too fast for him to get air or escape. With a whoosh, Riff was past his chance for air. Just when he thought his legs could no longer paddle and he couldn't hold his breath any longer, he was deposited with a wave into a clump of seaweed on the side of a mountain. Riff used his paws and tongue to clean himself of the seaweed tangling with his fur. As he started to sniff his surroundings to see where he was and how to get back to the snow dog camp, a turtle came crawling forward. A big green round turtle slowly crept towards Riff. It started to speak in a low but authoritative voice. "Riff, you are brave and strong. Me and my companions have been watching you," the turtle spoke. Riff was surprised to see and hear a turtle speak. For a moment he thought he'd hit his head too hard on the ice. The turtle came closer and started inspecting him with his beady eyes. "If you wish it, I can return you to your master." Riff barked, anxious to return home and check on his fellow dogs and master. The turtle continued. "But there is something I ask you to do first." The turtle went on as if Riff had not interrupted with his barking. "This cape and mask will help you in your quest, but you must promise to hide them and not use them once the quest is complete, unless, of course, you are called on to help another." The turtle had been there on his island in the river, waiting for the next dog to give the magical mask to. The mask had come to him from the way long ago. Turtles have long lifespans, so he wasn't sure how long he'd been waiting, but he knew the time was right to pass the mask on. The turtle came from a long line of turtles. From generation to generation, they were charged with protecting the mask and cape. Their mission was to ensure it went to a brave, deserving dog who would use the powers wisely. The turtle had seen Riff running with the pack. He knew he was brave. He was hoping one of the sled dogs would find their way here. It was like the universe answered him when the river whisked Riff to him. In the cold and unyielding Arctic, the mask and cape were created for times of dire need. The turtle thought this qualified. A lost child in a snowstorm, worried parents, and the weather getting worse by the minute. The mask and cape were created by the Grand Weaver. She was an elderly lady, one of the oldest in the Inuit clan. She spent her days at the spinning needle creating coats, scarves, mittens, and hats from her fellow clanspeople. The mask and cape came from scraps she didn't want to waste. She sang while she worked the machine. Her notes of love and kindness infused them with magic. Her beloved dog was the first to wear them. The dog thought they were for extra warmth, but soon found out the magical properties. When it was time for him to pass from this world, the cape and mask were given to the turtles to keep and pass on. Now, that very mask was going to be Riff's. A mask flew from the turtle's feet and landed directly on Riff's face, right between his eyes. It was a bright red mask, the color standing out in the snow and on Riff's white face. A cape landed over his body, behind his ears and over his neck. It too was red, and had a bright R in white in the middle. As Riff was inspecting his new digs, as he had never worn clothes before, the turtle continued. "There is a boy, a child trapped on the mountain. He needs a brave, strong dog like you to save him. That is where your master and the other dogs were headed. That was the mission of the day. Now with the storm, they won't be able to go back out for another day or so. You are on your own. Will you accept this mission?" Riff looked around. Snow was flying around, swirling around the sky. It was getting deeper and deeper. He wondered how the boy had gotten lost, but had no way to communicate his questions. Plus, the snow was getting worse by the minute. The boy needed him. Riff barked yes twice to accept. The turtle and the seaweed disappeared, leaving Riff alone in the white landscape at the bottom of the mountain. Riff thought for a moment he'd been hallucinating, but felt the mask and cape on his body. He wondered how the items would help him. He looked at the mountain. It looked so big and tall, an ominous landmark in a sea of white. The storm was building, and Riff could barely see in front of his face. How was he supposed to find a single child? First he needed food. His stomach was rumbling, and hunger was gnawing at him. Riff put his nose to the snow to try to sniff out some food. He was pleasantly surprised when his mask touched the snow. A small pile of dog food materialized in front of him. He licked up the food and started to think of a way to find the boy. It seemed like an impossible task, with the wind blowing and the snow piling up. He thought perhaps if he had the boy's scent, he could track him easier. He rubbed his face into the snow, touching the mask to the ground, and thought of an object that would have the boy's scent. He wanted a small object, nothing that would hurt the boy or leave him to the elements. He just needed a trinket, a piece with his smell. A small yellow blanket appeared in the snow. Riff inhaled the scent from the blanket and memorized it. He headed up the mountain, his paws and body scrambling for purchase in the snow, following the scent. The boy's name was Bailey. He'd gone with his parents numerous times delivering medical supplies to villages that were too far or too isolated to get them any other way. He'd been trained on how to make fire from sticks, seek shelter, and if they ever got separated, to head north and try to find a sled dog camp. Then the storm came, and the worst happened. One minute he was next to his parents while they were speaking to some local natives. The next, the wind and snow picked up, and he couldn't see anything. When the wind died down, he found himself alone in a white wonderland. At first he wasn't panicked. He would follow his parents' advice and training. He had no doubt he could find help with the snow dogs. However, he couldn't discern which way was north. He saw what he thought was a hill and thought to climb it to see if he could figure out a direction to go. The cold wind and blinding snow took him by surprise, and Bailey was tired from climbing, and he hadn't even reached the top. He was frustrated, cold, and scared. All of his parents' training and suggestions for this scenario seemed to go out of his head. He just wanted to be found. He just wanted to be warm. Still, he knew he couldn't stay here on this mountain. He must keep moving. He decided to get down off the mountain and find his way from there. He couldn't take the whipping winds and height of the hill anymore. He started to make his way back down when the wind picked up. A flurry of snow and wind hit him squarely in his body. The air pulled on his face, buffeted against his fur skin jacket. The ground beneath him shook and slipped, and he went down with it. Down, down he went until he landed with a loud bump. The wind went away as quickly as it had come, and all was now calm. Bailey's whole body was sore from his fall. Everything hurt him so much, he forgot about being cold. He slowly tried to get back up, but kept falling down from the slick ice on the ledge. He breathed a sigh and tried to remember what his parents had told him to do. He needed food and water. He took a small handful of snow from the hillside and put to his mouth and ate it. After eating the snow, he felt a little better. He patted the ground around him with the snow and tried once again to stand up. His feet still slipped, but the extra snow helped him find his purchase on the ledge. Shaken but determined to go on, he looked around him to try to find which direction was north. Head north, his parents had always told him. The sled dog camps were in the north. They would be able to help him. But which way was north? All Bailey saw was white, white everywhere. Not being able to find north, Bailey decided to keep making his way down, back to the ground. In the meantime, Riff was making his way up, following Bailey's scent. Riff's nose was to the frozen ground. His sole concentration was on finding the boy. He would sniff, look up, trot a ways, and repeat. When he lifted his head, he thought he saw movement. The smell was leading him that way. Riff grew excited and started to move faster. Riff climbed up the hill toward the movement and scent. As he was headed up, Bailey was headed down. Bailey was descending backward and didn't see the little white dog in the snow. Riff felt pressure on his head and let out a yip. The yell startled Bailey, and he started to lose his footing again. Bailey struggled to find his balance. Riff, seeing the boy, started to bark, 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 as if he was telling the boy, "See me, see me." Bailey looked to see what was making the noise and saw the pup. He calmed down, found his balance and footing. When Bailey was sound on the ground, Riff jumped into his arms. "Are you here to help me?" Bailey asked, remembering about the snow dogs. "Where's your sled and buddies?" "Bark, bark," Riff answered, licking the boy's face. They were both glad for the company, but the hard part had just begun. They were about to set off together when they heard a howl and saw a set of yellow eyes. Riff knew he had to protect the boy. He stood on his hind 2 legs, his cape billowing out behind him. The cape made the small dog look much larger. The coyote came nearer and nearer. The gray creature circled them, an uneasy presence on his territory. Bailey shivered. He tried to stay still, as not to startle the creature. Riff growled and snarled at the coyote. He opened his mouth and let his teeth show and snarled. The coyote saw a big, red, snarling creature and decided to flee. "There might be more of those. We should go," Bailey said. "Bark, bark," Riff answered in agreement. As they started again to make their way down the mountain, a trembling started. A loud boom went through the air. Snow started to tumble and gather. Looking up, Bailey saw balls of ice coming straight toward them. At first they both froze in fear. Riff gently took his teeth and pulled at Bailey's pants to get him moving away from the avalanche. The boy was stuck. Fear had overtook him. Riff put his mask to the snow and asked for a bubble of protection. They stood in the bubble, watching the snow bounce over them and around them. It was almost like being inside of a snow globe. The avalanche faded as quickly as it had started. All was peaceful and calm. The sun shone, reflecting on the white landscape. Once again they made their way down from the mountain. They landed back at the river that had swept Riff away. Riff remembered this river and knew they could follow it back to the camp. But first, they both needed food and water. Riff stuck his head in the river and used the mask to ask for some fish to eat. Bailey and Riff rested by the bank, ate the fish, and drank from the river. They were both glad to be off the mountain. As the sun started to go down and the day turned to night, they huddled together for warmth and comfort. Riff's warm Alaskan fur made a good blanket for Bailey. When the sun began to rise, they woke and started following the river once more. They seemed so lonely and small, a boy and a dog out in the Alaskan wilderness, white snow all around them, but they had each other. Riff's continued barking and sniffing the trail comforted Bailey. They made steady progress. Bailey followed Riff's lead. Making their way through the snow and ice was treacherous. They had to zip and zag their way through the landscape, sometimes leaving sight of the river, carefully placing their footsteps and paw prints in the mounds of snow so as not to fall or get sucked into a hole in the ground. They moved slowly and carefully, the sound of the river's current comforting them, telling them they were still on the right path. As careful as they were, a hole appeared in the snow where they were walking, and Bailey fell through. Only his head and shoulders could be seen. The rest of his body was buried in white. Not hearing footsteps behind him, Riff turned around to see why Bailey wasn't following. Bailey started to panic. His movements were making him go deeper and deeper like quicksand. Riff started to dig Bailey out with his paws. Scratching and digging at the snow, the white powder flew everywhere. Bailey saw the snow starting to give way around his body, and he used his arms to help Riff free him. Riff pulled with all of his might on Bailey's coat and heaved him out of the snowbank. Bailey was unharmed, though wet and cold. The snow had gotten inside of his jacket and all over his body. "Oh, boy," Bailey said, hugging Riff. "That was a close one. Thanks for saving me, boy, though I wish we could have a fire so I could melt some of the snow off me." Riff barked in response and tugged on Bailey's pants. They trudged a little way further from the river to where there were some fallen logs on the ground. Riff barked at Bailey. "You want me to gather the logs for a fire, boy?" Bailey asked. Riff barked in reply. Bailey gathered the logs into a spot on the ground and cleared as much snow as he could. Riff was always by his side. They made a small circle, and Riff used the power of the mask to start a small fire. The flames and heat felt good to Bailey, but it was too hot for Riff. Riff went to the outer edge of the circle where he could keep an eye on the boy. The fire blazed orange in the night. Bailey took his mittens off and reached his hands out to take the chill out of his fingers. As the fire burned, the flames and warmth attracted other creatures. Soon they were surrounded on all sides by a pack of wolves. The wolves howled and circled them. Riff moved closer to Bailey and the fire. He snarled at them as they moved closer in. The wolves did not seem to appear to mean harm, but rather they seemed watchful. Their eyes glowed in the dark with a menacing stare. They gathered around the fire, howling and staring. Riff continued to growl and snarl. It seemed they were at a standoff. Riff thought maybe if he sounded like a wolf, they would leave. Instead of growling and snarling, he let out a wolf-like howl. The circle of wolves joined in the chorus, and they all howled into the night. Seeing there was no danger, the wolves left as quickly as they had come. As a new day approached, Riff used his paws to scuttle snow onto the fire. Bailey tramped it down with his boots to ensure no sparks were left behind. They continued to make their way back to the river and soon came to the place where the accident that had separated Riff from the fellow snow dogs happened. Riff started to shake and whine at the memory of that day. "What's wrong, boy?" Bailey asked, coming up to Riff and petting him. As if answering Bailey's question, Riff thought he heard barking. Could it be? Were his fellow dogs trying to find him? He looked around and saw Bailey move his head around as if he heard it too. Both Bailey and Riff hastened their steps toward the sound. The barking echoed all around them like a beacon home. Riff started to bark back and then stayed where he was. Bailey wanted to run ahead, but Riff grabbed his pants and barked at him to stay still. Riff knew if they kept moving, the other snow dogs would not be able to find them. He barked and barked until his little throat hurt and was raw. He pulled on Bailey to try to make him understand. Bailey stood by Riff. He wanted so much to go towards the sound, but the little dog had not failed him so far. He was frozen in indecision when a voice came across the way. "Riff! Riff, is that you?" the master yelled. "Bark, bark," Riff answered in reply. "I'm coming, boy. Stay where you are. The dogs have your scent now." The words carried authority, and Bailey stayed by Riff. In no time, the sled dogs came around the bend with the team and Bailey's parents. They had done it. They had made their way back to the snow dogs. The storm had lightened enough to try looking for the boy again. Heavy at heart and thinking they had lost Riff, the sled team knew they still had to go on. They still had a job to do. The snow team greeted Riff with playfulness and dog kisses. Bailey's parents hugged him tight. "He saved me, Mom, Dad. The dog here saved me. Can I keep him?" Bailey asked. "Well, we can talk about that later. Let's go somewhere warm and out of the cold," his mom answered. Everyone made their way back to camp, happy to be reunited. Riff was going to bury his mask and cape in the snow for his next adventure, but it was not meant to be. While he was headed to sleep, he heard the turtle's voice in his dream. "You were chosen, Riff. You have more missions to complete," the voice said. His master seemed to understand, because he came by and petted him. "Riff, you did well. You are no ordinary snow dog. Go fulfill the duties to your mask and cape," his owner said, "though I am going to miss you." Released from the snow team, Riff left and headed out toward the unknown. Riff left the snow dog camp unsure of where to go. He heard Bailey and his parents talking about the sea and a ship. He thought it would be fun to see the ocean from a boat. Surely someone on the sea could use help from a dog with a magical mask and cape. He made his way toward the dock where all the ships came in. He hid in the cargo bay, anxious for his new adventures. The ship chugged its way through the waters away from Alaska to a place called California. Stay tuned for Riff's adventures in California. The Sunshine State is a hard place for an Alaskan snow dog.